started. I am Andrew Holland, Chief Operating Officer of the American Security Project. This is our Climate Week seminar on climate change and national security, featuring Admiral Gunn and Judge Alice Hill. We are excited to have them with us, and our attendees, we're excited to have you here with us as well. You know, for Climate Week, ASP has done a climate change and national security event of some sort for many years running. Since this is the 10th anniversary of Climate Week, and we've been a part of that many times, always up in New York City though. And so the unique challenges and opportunities here of virtual events means that we are still pleased to be here and still pleased to be a part of Climate Week. But we do miss our partnerships and seeing everybody at the climate group and around New York, just the excitement of New York this time of year. So it's too bad that's the way of the world these days. But we are lucky to have our two panelists here with us and have all of you joining us here online as well. I'm gonna just a couple of quick ground rules for folks coming in. You're not able to talk, but you are able to post questions in the chat. I'd ask that you do that. We are gonna have a open Q&A with our panelists here. We're actually gonna just kind of encourage a discussion. Each of them will have about, you know, we'll get 5 to 10 minutes, as long as they want to introduce their work on climate change and national security after I give this intro, but then we're happy to have an open conversation with questions from the audience, and I'll be able to moderate those questions. To introduce American Security Project to those of you who haven't been on one of our events or anything like this, we are a nonpartisan national security think tank. We were founded about 15 years ago by a group of senators and former senators, including Gary Hart, John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, and Warren Rudman, to found an institution to think long-term about what are America's long-term national security opportunities and challenges. The idea is to get away from the short-term politics and think about our long-term issues. Very quickly, one of the things that we realized was going to be a problem and has since become a problem is the impact of climate change on national security. We've done extensive writing, research, speaking on this issue, and I'd encourage everybody here to take a look at our website, americansecurityproject.org, and you can see a lot of detail on what we've done and what we suggest that we should do. You can follow us on Twitter at AmSecProject and Facebook as well. We've got a lot of stuff out there, and we are so happy to have with us our two panelists. First, we're going to have Admiral Gunn, who spent 35 years in the Navy, including combat duty in Vietnam. He finished up as an Inspector General of the Department of the Navy. He had commands throughout the surface force. After his naval career, he was president of the Institute for Public Research at CNA, chair of the Naval Postgraduate School, and we are so lucky that he was a founding board member of the American Security Project. He really is an expert on national security, and he's spoken around the country on these issues of climate change and national security. Judge Alice Hill is David Rubenstein Senior Fellow for Energy and Environment at the Council on Foreign Relations. She previously served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Resilience on the National Security Council, where she was the primary author and mover of the 2016 Presidential Memorandum on Climate Change and National Security. She is co-author of Building a Resilient Tomorrow, and probably is one of the country's leading experts on the resilience and climate change impacts here at home. So we're lucky to have both of them. We're just going to go ahead and get started with Admiral Gunn, and I'll turn it over to you to give your opening comments on, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Andrew. It really is a pleasure to be here. It's great to serve on a panel with Alice and to be part of the American Security Project process for Climate Week. Throughout my career, I've been in places where you could see the effects of weather, you could see the impact of trade and a variety of things. Um, what we see right now in the rapid change to our climate is that it is, it's a study of, actually a story of declining resources and shifting resources in ways that make it tough for people who have lived for millennia in the places where they now live to continue to survive there. And the impact of climate change, these consequences are being felt, will continue to be felt by those who are least able to contend with them. That is, who live in places that don't have adequate governance, places which there are not the financial resources to recover from the consequences of climate change. And so those who can stand at least are those who are being impacted most and will continue to be that way. We talked earlier about looking at specific sections of the world, and one that is very important to me and very important in the national security of the United States and increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change is Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time during the Vietnam War, mostly offshore, but in the vicinity of Vietnam. And I've suffered the effects of violent weather there, typhoons, monsoons, southwest monsoons that are increasingly wetter, northeast monsoons that are increasingly drier, both of those affecting the way people live in Southeast Asia. Sea level rise is something to which nations in Southeast Asia are most vulnerable. And as a matter of fact, 4 of the most vulnerable nations in the world, the 10 most nations in the world, are Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia, nations that ring the South China Sea, where of course the expansionist Chinese are now running into and running over the claims of other nations ringing the South China Sea for the rights to resources there, for fishing, for oil, and the like. And so 7 military bases have been built on artificial islands by the Chinese in the South China Sea. Illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is an international effect of the fact that overfishing has taken place in the South China Sea and elsewhere at the same time that fish stocks have dwindled, partly due to the acidification of the ocean, which is closely linked to the increase in carbon in the atmosphere. All of these things conspire to make life in the future in Southeast Asia much more tenuous. Those are concerns for the United States. Those are national security concerns for the United States. But in the larger sense, the pillars on which US national security rests are each affected in their own way and will increasingly be affected by climate change. The economic pillar, the diplomatic and development pillar, and of course, the military pillar of American strength. For the military and for the future of the military, both the ability to execute missions and the demand for the military to execute those missions are increasing and will continue to increase at the same time that domestically, the American military is having more and more trouble with training, realistic training, because of the changes in the climate, the changes that the terrain and waterfall and the like make on the climate here at home, and also because often the US's military is asked to perform domestically to deal with the consequences of climate change. And also, of course, military facilities like bases are at risk as well. We could go on about that. I won't, but I think that's probably a decent way to start. Thanks.
Admiral Gunn, thank you. And we will, I'm sure, dig into some of those in questions and answers, and we'll go from there. Alice Hill, thank you for being with us. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Over to you to get us started. And I'd remind everybody to feel free to put your questions into the chat box.
Well, thanks, Andrew, and what a pleasure to be on the panel with you, Admiral Gunn. Just so appreciate your leadership on this issue for many years, and in fact, your work helped educate me. As Andrew alluded to, I previously was a judge, so I did not come to climate and security just out of interest. I came to it because I got an assignment. I joined the Obama administration as Senior Counselor to Secretary Napolitano at the Department of Homeland Security. Of course, you know that DHS was born out of the events of 9/11, so it has a focus on anti-terrorism, but it also includes FEMA for our emergency management. It covers our borders, looking at our immigration, and there's Coast Guard, which has a huge responsibility for the Arctic. So in 2009, when I arrived at this huge sprawling security agency, 220,000 employees, President Obama had just issued an executive order that required all agencies to engage in sustainability planning, but also adaptation planning. And in those days, and probably still a bit now, in security agencies, it was not viewed as a career enhancer to be working on climate change. So as the new person, I recall it essentially was everybody looking around a big conference table, nobody's hands, elbows crossed, nobody wants to take this assignment, and it's, oh, give it to her, she's new. So that's how I ended up working on climate change, but it also gave me what I think is very important in this work is an aha moment. It gave me the time to think about what climate change would mean to a security agency in 2009 that had responsibility for Homeland Security. And through that work and through work with the Navy, Navy had its own task force on climate change, working with scientists from across the federal government. Basically, our task force learned that we needed to care now deeply about what climate change was doing, and that it would affect virtually all the mission sets of DHS. When I moved to the White House, I continued to focus on climate change. I became concerned when I was there about how little climate change little role it played in the conversations I was in within the Situation Room and elsewhere. No consideration frequently of what new climate impacts would mean for migration, for water security, many of the things that Admiral Gunn has alluded to. Human security would be changed profoundly by the impacts we were seeing and were projected to see. It's hard to get your head around, but in the next 50 years, humans will experience probably more change in their climate than they've experienced in the last 60,000 years. That has profound implications for security. So working with the intelligence agencies, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, the scientific agencies, NASA, NOAA, and others, we developed an executive order requiring all agencies to work into their planning consideration of the security risks posed by climate change, and to make sure that we were developing the necessary intelligence to inform policymakers so that we could make better choices going forward diplomatically in terms of our development work overseas to help communities, nations deal with these accelerating impacts. President Obama did sign that order, and as soon as President Trump took office, that order was rescinded. We have comparatively little work still going on within the federal government focused on the security risks posed by climate change. Congress has asked the Department of Defense to focus on its installations and the risks from climate impacts, as well as there's some been recent developments of more environmental focus. But today we still don't have that incorporation or mainstreaming of climate risk into our decision making. So as Admiral Gunn said, there are questions about training. There are questions about assets. Can our planes fly? Can our jets fly in very hot conditions? There are huge issues about our ports. Norfolk Navy Base, all the military installations there threatened by sea level rise. We've built things that aren't resilient. We built a space radar system on an atoll in the Pacific in 2013. Cost us about $1 billion. It's supposed to track space junk so that that junk doesn't run into all the satellites that we have put into space. But we failed to consider sea level rise when we built that, so that now the atoll is already threatened. Its freshwater supplies are threatened by salination. Those are the types of issues that we need to be considering to be prepared for what is a very rapidly changing environmental landscape that has effects on the ability of people to find shelter, food, fresh water. And we are very concerned that this will give rise to greater conflicts, certainly exacerbate pre-existing conflicts going forward. So it's really my honor and pleasure to be a part of this discussion and focus back on this issue. I just recently heard an expression that I think I will adopt going forward. We talk about national security and climate, but what we really need to do is talk about climatizing security. That means that just in all of our security decisions, we have to think, is there a threat from climate impacts? Or are there things that we should be thinking about now so we're better prepared going forward in the choices we're making? Thank you again for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Alice, thank you. I think it's really important, something that I kind of picked up from both of you, is that you didn't start your career to work on climate change issues. And I can say the same thing as well when I was working on Capitol Hill. And maybe this is a common thing for a lot of people in security and even, beyond that. You may not be interested in climate change, but climate change is interested in you. and it is coming whether you want it or not. The science is clear. The temperatures have already gone up by perhaps 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, and we're running close up to that 1.5 degrees that we've tried to commit to through Paris Agreement. And so it's coming and it's happening right now. There's another kind of term that comes up when you think of that. So what is to be done, right? What is to be done? What is the policy sort of things? Obviously there's a broad societal goal of we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and figure out a way to get it under control. But, and there's a question here from, I think, Patrick Slattery. What are the greatest impacts to deal with over the next 5 years or so? And because mitigation, reducing emissions, is about something that's outside of that time frame. But there are things to be done right now. What sort of government policies, Admiral Gunn, in your experience within the Pentagon and the Navy, what should be done there? Judge Hill, within the White House or elsewhere in the U.S. government, what is to be done?
Alice, do you want to take that?
Yeah, Alice, you can give a start.
Sure.
You've tried to address this.
Depends which lens we're looking at it through. And one thing that's very important to keep in mind with climate change, as Andrew has alluded to, we have baked in continuing change for at least the next several decades, just because of the way the carbon emissions from the past have accumulated. So it's like a blanket. That's a blanket and it's cold evening, and we will just keep heating up under that blanket, irrespective of how many more emissions we have. If we got our emissions to zero today, which we will not, we would still keep heating up. So we need to be planning for the impacts that we can anticipate as a result of that. One of the first things that we can do, and I think it's so obvious with what's happening with the United States right now, is we have to understand that with climate change, we will see compound, concurrent, or very close in time consecutive events. And the cluster of those things can greatly stress the systems that we already have, including our emergency management and our ability to respond quickly. So we're seeing our FEMA heavily stressed, and of course this is in the midst of a pandemic. So we need to rethink now our emergency management capabilities. The other thing that we need to look through to make sure we're doing is that in terms of our development work and our diplomacy, we have our eye on climate change going forward. We do have some good news here in that all of our aid work, our development work, as a result of a executive order, I did lead this one as well, but it's still in place. It requires all of our aid overseas through our through the multilateral banks, as well as USAID and the Millennial Challenge Corporation, to be screened for climate resilience. So that means if we're making an investment in a bridge, we're going to build the bridge high enough to withstand future flooding. Kind of a basic measure, but very important to preserve the investments we make. Unfortunately, we do not have a similar policy in the United States yet. So we still build infrastructure without considering future flood risk or other risk. And the other thing, overseas, we need to be planning for many more acute events. We are seeing temperatures unlike those extremes that we've ever seen before. And there will be, at some point in the future, in all likelihood, areas of the world that will become basically uninhabitable, sort of in a swath around the globe, because the temperatures will simply get too high. So we need to think about migration, and that is an international issue that we need to work with other countries on to find out what are we going to do as more and more people are on the move because of either food insecurity, lack of access to fresh water, seeing terrorist groups, other bad actors take advantage of these situations and try to recruit. And we see a growth of organized crime. What are we going to do about these occurrences that are driven or exacerbated by climate change? As Admiral Gunn and his group at CNA coined the term threat multiplier, all of this will threaten our ability to feel as secure as we have historically. We will be feeling even less secure because there will be so many events happening at once that threaten global security.
Thank you. Admiral, highlight how the military plans for and thinks about acute events and how to respond to those.
Yeah, and relying both on that kind of background and also what Judge Hill said. Let me digress for just a moment. I'll come back to the point. As part of the American Security Project, also as part of the CNA Military Advisory Board, of which I'm the vice chair, I've traveled extensively throughout the United States. I've talked to and with many groups in many of the states where terrific things are happening, where unbeknownst to me, prior to coming there, I was not aware that there were all of these local efforts being undertaken. People on the ground, near the sea, understand what the potential risk is and are already beginning to deal with it. One of the problems we've had for the last several years is that the federal government has been in the way. Fortunately, I think for the most part, states have gotten out of the way in the regional efforts and the efforts by NGOs and local groups to deal with the threats that people see. But we need to get the federal government aligned with states and aligned with the regional and local efforts, which are already underway, as I said, and commercial efforts as well, to unleash this imagination, this innovation that you can see everywhere in the United States if you go around and look. The Navy in particular, but the military in general, is dealing with a future where much of what the Defense Department has invested in over the decades is at risk in one way or another, from fires or floods or inundation due to sea level rise. Alice mentioned the Hampton Roads, Norfolk, Virginia area. All of the military services in the United States have important assets at risk there in an area which is as threatened by sea level rise as any in the United States and is already suffering many of the effects. What's required, and what I think that the military is doing a very good job with, is planning for some kind of retreat where that's necessary and some kind of defense where that's possible. No kidding, there are going to be resources involved. The military has to be funded to do this. Just in the Navy's case, and the Navy and the Air Force rather, the Union of Concerned Scientists has identified 18 bases and stations on the East Coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast that are threatened by imminent sea level rise. And so all of those have to be adjusted in some way, either through defense or retreat, to accommodate this and allow the continued generation of readiness, which is, after all, what the services do when they're at home. The 5-year time horizon is an interesting one. What I think that urgency, or number one, I think 5 years is a reasonable time horizon to get our butts in gear. And at the same time, this is the time when we need to get our regulatory and legislative structures in place in a way that will facilitate developments here at home, but also leadership worldwide. The US needs to reassume, as still the second biggest polluter in the world, we need to reassume our position of leadership in addressing sea level rise and all of the other consequences of climate change.
Admiral, there's a question here from Gabrielle Lowe, who asks about the U.S. military as one of the forerunners in leveraging green technology. So obviously the military is threatened by the effects of climate change, but she mentions the Great Green Fleet and things like this. We've seen a lot of innovation in clean energy and resilient energy infrastructure from the military. What do you see coming in the next decade from the U.S. military in that space?
I think important things will be coming. However, everyone needs to understand the constraints that the military is under. There is a certain influential segment in the body politic in the United States that believes the military should only be involved pretty directly and make the investments pretty directly in things that kill people and break things. And so, not only for that reason, but because it's a genuine concern of the military that resources be invested in ways that will improve combat effectiveness, there needs to be in the military a solid link between any proposed kind of acquisition or investment and the improvement that will result in mission performance. The Great Green Fleet was an interesting example. I've always thought that the terminology was a little unfortunate because it brought down the legislative house on the Navy too often. But the fact was that all of the Navy aircraft carriers and all of the submarines are powered by nuclear power. So once it was the case that all of the surface ships and all of the aircraft that the Navy operates were certified to run on a mix of biofuels and traditional fuels, then you could deploy a force that was able to operate on a profile of emissions that was much reduced. So the aircraft carrier and submarine that have a bunch of surface escorts with them and an air wing to fly, all of them would be qualified to operate on alternative fuels. That was done not because it was a chemistry experiment, not because it was somebody's politically warm idea, but because the military never knows when it goes, whether it's the Navy or the Army or the Air Force, whether when it gets to an area where it's going to operate, it will be on the traditional fuels and the traditional purity that we've come to expect, or whether there will be something else that we'll have to depend on for operations. But that is the kind of choice that the military needs to make. How will we improve flexibility, effectiveness, and efficiency when we conduct combat operations?
Thanks, Admiral. Judge Hill, we've got a question here about, and maybe I'll try and push a couple of these together, about migration and specifically internal migration, internal displaced people within the United States. We think about this as a problem for the rest of the world. And we, of course, it is, we are a wealthy nation that has resources, but deploying them is difficult, and figuring out where it's way to do this is difficult. And with somebody else mentions that perhaps areas of the world, and there's areas of the American Southwest that could be going into mega drought cycles and that sort of thing. Obviously, sea level rise along the Gulf Coast. We see these repeated storms even this year along the Gulf Coast. Internal migration in the United States, building resiliency in that way. What effort should be done in this sort of stuff?
Great question. We definitely need to be thinking and planning for internal displacement. And as your questions show, it could be through an acute event, like the wildfires that are occurring now. They'll be homeless, or a big storm where we see after Katrina, just a diaspora out of New Orleans. And we need to think about what that will look like in an acute event or a slow moving event, as you've mentioned, a drought, sea level rise coming, and just homes are soggy all the time, so people are going to have to leave. It raises a whole host of problems. On the acute side, one of the things we need to think about is making that transition away smoother. We saw after the Camp Fire in 2018, we saw about 20,000 people descend on the town of Chico, California, which was already, it was the nearest town. It was already suffering from a housing shortage. There was a lack of affordable housing, and all of a sudden 20,000 people show up. Their kids need to go to school. The kindergarten is overwhelmed, and it's a stress point for local leaders how to be welcoming to these folks who have just lost their homes, but also not disrupt their own economy and the lives of their own town. So we need to have plans in place where people will move if their town is lost. We also need to have plans in place as to how and if we are going to rebuild. Right now, we leave that up to state and local decision makers, and what we see is we're rebuilding right back in the places that just burned, and sometimes just in the same way they were before that they burned, or similarly that it was flooded. So we will need to focus deeply on the disruptions caused by internal displacement in the United States. It will be at levels that has been predicted to be at extremely high levels going forward. One area that we need to watch closely is, of course, what that means for our most vulnerable populations, those that are disabled, elderly, unable to move as easily, children, and those that do not have the financial means to get themselves out of a dangerous situation. Most of American renters don't have $2,000 in the bank account, so to talk about relocating, evacuating is difficult. We also have licensing barriers across the United States. So if you're a nurse in one location, getting your license in another, or a lawyer, many things to be thought through. And in a decentralized United States, in terms of many of these decisions, it's going to be harder for people to cross borders easily. So we need to think through what that means. Thanks.
Yeah, it's no easy questions with these things, and certainly that there's a lot of money involved too in this. So we've had a number of questions here about diplomacy, and I really want to take something from Admiral Gunn's introduction, where he said, 3 pillars of security: economics, diplomacy, and national security. And diplomacy is a key part of this. The U.S. pulled out of the Paris Agreement 3 years ago now, and I think they will officially pull out the day after the election, or something like that. But even under the Paris Agreement, the US and the world is not meeting the emissions gap. There's a study showing kind of the dire gap between where we pledged to be and where we are going to be. And so in this week where the UN General Assembly is meeting, even if virtually, and you know, there's potentially an area for American leadership that is missing in the world right now on climate and climate diplomacy, and you know, there's areas to be worked on. Maybe Admiral Gunn, if you want to lead off on, you know, why diplomacy here is such an important part of national security as well, and what is there to be done here.
Sure. At the risk of saying something that almost everyone on this call has already heard, when General Mattis was still in uniform and he was testifying before Congress, he said, if you don't fund the State Department adequately, and I'm paraphrasing here, you're going to have to buy me more bullets. That represents, in my view, pretty much the predominant opinion of military leaders, people in uniform in particular, throughout the U.S. Defense Department. We want to be the court of last resort. We want to be the last step that the nation needs to take in order to achieve its aims overseas. There's a great outfit called the U.S. Global Leadership Conference, and some 400 of us retired military defense officials, corporate executives, are involved annually in the business of trying to support investments in diplomacy and defense. And regrettably, for the last 3 or 4 years, all of the budgets submitted to the Congress by the administration have dramatically proposed cutting the State Department and USAID budgets. That is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Not only do we need America's moral leadership on addressing the challenges of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, but we need America to be present in the conversations. We have, over, unfortunately, several decades, missed the opportunity to assume the leadership mantle that the US has earlier in the 1950s and before, dominantly or importantly led the world in moving forward. This is the challenge of our day, climate change, and the challenge, unfortunately, will have to be met militarily eventually to the degree it's not met now, diplomatically and in terms of US assistance. Those are important investments in the future of the United States, not just the future of the world.
Thank you. I think that's right. We've got a couple questions here about the Arctic, and Judge Hill, you had mentioned that Homeland Security, of course, often overlooked, includes the Coast Guard, and Coast Guard operates the U.S. Icebreaker fleet, such as it is right now, but they are building a new icebreaker, and they're looking at more stuff happening in the Arctic. Why is the Arctic, something so far away from, where I am here in Washington, but literally from anybody in the lower 48? Why is this something that Department of Homeland Security worries about, the Navy has to think about, the military overall, and what impacts are we seeing there today? And I'd note, actually, they just notified today that the Arctic almost set a record for least ice cover, at least annual ice cover, that only behind 2012. So a very low amount of sea ice on the Arctic Ocean. That's why this matters. Alice Hill, what do you think on this?
So you're absolutely right. Because we're seeing so much heat in the Arctic, it's warming at least as twice, maybe 3 times as fast as the rest of the world. Because we're seeing temperatures in Siberia of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, unheard of. we are seeing an ocean open up. And that's the first time since Christopher Columbus, as Admiral Roughhead, the former CNO of the Navy, says, and that's of great geopolitical interest. It's for shipping. We are seeing an increased level of shipping occurring across the Arctic Ocean. Meanwhile, Russia has, I guess, shoved the snow off of its facilities and is building up a deep presence along its very long Arctic coast in the hopes that it claims that it will be peaceful. It just wants to support shipping along the northern sea route. The neighbors of Russia have treated that with a bit more skepticism. The Scandinavian nations have expressed deep concern that Russia is militarizing that coast and that there could be greater threats going forward. They're certainly putting in large-scale investments and doing a number of demonstrations of their might. There was a rather silly example of this where the Russians planted a Russian flag on the floor of the North Pole. Be that as it may be, we also see China asserting itself. It has called itself a near-Arctic nation. In 2000, I believe it was 2012, when there was lowest level sea ice, it sent a tanker across in this first demonstration that goods could go across. And that will save China an enormous amount on shipping costs and could have huge implications there, of course, for global trade. And then the Arctic is loaded with all sorts of resources that countries may want to mine going forward for their own profit. Unfortunately, the United States has not been a full-time player in the discussions about the Arctic and trying to keep it peaceful. We have never ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, so we do not have an official seat at the table as we decide important, as the countries decide important rights about what will happen in the Arctic. And we've seen increasingly that we, with our allies, have had exercises there to show that we do have strength as well. But as you pointed out, we are very weak in icebreakers, and just, I know it's counterintuitive, but there'll still be ice in the Arctic. It'll still be a harsh environment. And to get those tankers through, or you have ecotourism, you want an icebreaker that can go in there and take care of and help people. So many fronts to be worried about from an ecological, environmental, national security, and it's all opening very quickly, as you've said. But the US, in contrast to Russia, has not made the kinds of investments. We do not have a deep sea port along our Alaskan coast. And last time I checked, we do not have a hangar in Barrow, or I think it's called Inuit now, for our planes to be sheltered in at night so they can start up in the morning. Huge gaps there that need to be addressed, and very expensive in doing so. One last thing is that what we already have there is sinking into the permafrost, because the permafrost is melting, and so that infrastructure becomes very unstable. So we need to even go reinforce what we already have there. Changing quickly, needs a lot of attention, very important to us geopolitically and long-term for our ability to protect our interests there.
Yeah, thank you. And I'd note to all of our attendees here, I just put a link to a new report that ASP just put out yesterday on Arctic climate change and national security, why it's important, and what is to be done. It's a key issue that I hope people are starting to be more aware of, but it's always hard to get people focused on an area, you know, that technically is so far away, and like you said, a new ocean. We're not used to preparing for this sort of stuff. Let's see.
Andrew,
go ahead, please.
Let me mention that while I'm not a climate scientist, I am aware, and probably many people on the call are aware as well, that the warming of the Arctic, particularly at the rate that Judge Hill talked about, 2 to 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet, has influence around the Arctic and the other parts of the high north as well. The frozen Arctic has helped to keep Greenland and the Greenland ice sheet, which of course is aground, unlike the ice in the Arctic Ocean, has helped to keep it frozen. And it is melting at a greater rate now because that feedback loop in the Arctic, where the blue water that's been exposed absorbs more heat than it used to when it was reflected from ice. All of that is a compound problem. And then Judge Hill talked about the melting permafrost. The permafrost in Russia is also on fire. And so the methane leaking, because it's gotten past the melted point, and the methane leaking has caught fire. And there are enormous uncontrolled fires in northern Russia, in Siberia, and at the same time, that's contributing potentially dramatic amounts of carbon to our problem with the atmosphere and the oceans.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic.
Yeah, well put. Well put.
It is, you know, one of the, it used to be the canary in the coal mine, but now you could say it's a lot bigger than a canary. This is literally on fire. So if that's not a warning sign, I don't know what is. We have a question here. I think this is good for both of you. Providing domestic support to hurricane and wildfire has become kind of an increasing military mission. We see active duty forces and certainly National Guard forces being deployed to respond to wildfires, hurricanes, other extreme events. How can we plan for this better and deal with this better as we see more and more of these extreme events happening? Should there be a detailed planning or training that the military or perhaps DHS, Judge Hill, goes through to do more to be kind of responsive to these situations?
Well, defense support to civil authorities is of great importance when we have acute events. But if we're going to have this volume of events or this level of events, I don't think we want to be making the Army, the Navy, whomever, the Department of Defense, our fallback go-to for what will become much more frequent occurrence. We need, in my opinion, to increase our emergency capacities on the civilian side. And there are a number of reasons for that. And one thing is that you want to protect from having the military called on too many for support to too many civilian issues. There has been a deep separation between the Department of Defense and the civilian authorities within the United States that we want to respect. So we need them in our back pocket in case things get really bad, but I don't recommend that we call on them. Rather, we should be strengthening our own civilian response capabilities. And there's another reason for that. The reason we have such a strong military is we're concerned about our national security, and that is outside our borders. So we don't want our troops to be tired out, injured, damaged by events at home, and then be their capabilities degraded as a result of helping us at home. So all of this will be expensive, but we also want to make sure that we have the capabilities that we need to respond to the kinds of events that we are seeing within our own borders and that are projected to occur with increasing frequency. To simply turn to DOD, I think, is short-sighted and not really planning for a future that will look different than our current present.
Yeah, well said. We have a couple questions, and that's a good one to lead into this. We have a couple questions about the need to restructure government. We have somebody asking, is there a need to restructure the National Security Council to better include climate change in this? Is there actual things, within the Pentagon that should be done. We do see that Congress has put pressure on the Department of Defense to continue to plan and prepare for the effects of climate change. But are there things that is it a personnel issue? Is it a leadership issue? Or is there some actual, bureaucratic box shuffling that can be done that would more effectively allow the U.S. government to plan for and think ahead for these issues? Maybe.
Alice, the White House perspective?
Sure. I'll tell you, I think that our current structure, which is the same structure that's reflected in the State Department, reflects post-World War II, a Cold War approach to what is occurring on the ground. So we have functional directorates in the National Security Council. So I headed one of them, the Resilience Directorate. And then you also have regional directorates. So you'll have the Middle East or Africa. Important, but in both the State Department and surely in the National Security Council, it's those regional directorates that tend to dominate the discussion. And we have a handicap here. Most of the people that hold those positions, like me, have had no formal education. You've heard, we all came to climate change some other way. Mm-hmm. And so we have learned about climate change on our own through whatever media, whatever sources we chose to have, or whoever was providing us access to information. And that is true for many of our leaders now. So they do not have a grounding in the science or an understanding, and they often probably haven't had an assignment that required them to learn about it. So then they're thrust into an assignment to be responsible for Africa, and they may not have a deep understanding of what's ahead for Africa. And then we have, but they don't, because of all the political discussion and because it's not a career enhancer, they haven't been asking, from what I could determine from the intelligence agencies, there's no demand for understanding what's happening from Africa because they're trying to respond to an urgent request. And of course, climate change is a slow moving, something that can be dealt with, people think, in the far future. Of course, that's false that it can be dealt with in the future. But so you've set up this organization where it's very difficult for climate change to play any kind of significant role or have any kind of impact on policy making. That was true in the Obama administration in terms of geopolitical, strategic planning, and I'm virtually certain it's true in the Trump administration. So yes, we need to rethink how we integrate climate concerns in all the decision making because it affects everything. It affects every system we have. It affects water, food, security, transportation, communications, virtually everything. So we need to figure out a way to have it considered across the board and not these false dichotomies that it's something that doesn't really, it's only in a functional bureau that they need to worry about resilience. We need to worry about resilience in Africa and Middle East and everywhere else.
Admiral Gunn, you see the same problems within the military, right?
I do. And I think that while it's been far too gradual, there has been movement in the Defense Department in the general direction that will be helpful in this question. Beginning in 2008, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief became official missions for the U.S. Department of Defense, which meant that you could buy things to do that. You could train and execute humanitarian missions, not only overseas, but even it's been useful in some domestic humanitarian situations. There are now in each of the services, certainly in the Navy, but I believe in the others as well, a consolidated office for management of all facilities. Now that organization is capable of looking at climate change and its impacts on the facilities collectively across the Navy, certainly, and I believe the others as well. There has been in each of the service secretariats, the Department of the Navy, for example, created a position for the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy and Environment. That didn't exist before, and it's a focus now of information and cautions and initiatives in addressing climate change for the Department of the Navy. I think the other services have those things as well, but it is gradualism. There is no big movement of boxes. That's not what the Defense Department is good at. And you can look at the early 1950s and late 1940s and tell how the case proceeded then. Anyway, yes, there needs to be a focus of this. There needs to be somebody, I think Judge Hill is exactly right. It needs to be a whole collection of knowledgeable folks who get up every morning and look at everything that the Defense Department and the State Department and FEMA and the rest of the Department of Homeland Security are doing in terms of climate change.
Yeah, and better ways to integrate there was a question here of how might the science and agencies work closer with DoD and State Department and NSC. I think that's an important thing to remember here too, is that within the US government, there are a huge amount of competent, the world's leading scientists within NASA, NOAA, NSF, DOE, getting them to be able to integrate their knowledge with the national security decision makers is a challenge, but also, probably easier than bringing it in from, outside the government. So.
Well, a whole of government approach is certainly needed, but that is pretty much a hollow term. It's used fairly frequently, but it generally doesn't mean very much. And I'm afraid so far it hasn't meant much in this regard either.
Right. Well, I want to thank both of you here. We're coming up on the hour here, and I want to thank both of you for taking the time today to really answer some really great questions, and thank our panelists or thank our attendees for really great questions as well. We could keep going for another hour, I think, on all of the good questions that everybody has looked into. I'd encourage a lot of the attendees, if we didn't get to your question, we actually probably have answers on our website. Take a look at americansecurityproject.org. We've talked about a lot of these things before. And we hope that it's been informative for you all. Any final thoughts from Admiral Gunn, Judge Hill? I'll leave it to you.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, as I said at the outset, being on this panel with Judge Hill and with you, Andrew, and also talking to this audience. One of the things that energizes me these days is the number of people who evidence serious interest in this set of topics, the topics which are so important to our country and the future of the world. And it's exciting, and it's a pleasure to be part of it. And thanks very much to ASP for the opportunity to do that.
Thank you. Judge Hill, any final thoughts?
Yes, I want to thank Admiral Gunn and you, Andrew, for your organization with ASP. You have put this issue on the map early on. I've been the beneficiary of it when I was first starting out, for all the important thought and analysis that you have put out. And I'm deeply grateful for that. And I'm grateful for you for continuing to shine a spotlight on it. I do share the enthusiasm that I'm sensing, that people finally are beginning to say, wow, we really need to work on this, which we do. And of course, they can turn to the great work that's already been done by Admiral Gunn and you, Andrew, and others. But we need everyone. This is an all hands on deck issue. It will affect everything. And we need people thinking through how we can best position ourselves in whatever industry, whatever concern they're working on, to have better outcomes. Because if we don't start focusing on this, it really does become apocalyptic. It becomes very scary. So we need to focus on what's ahead, our path, what can we do, and start fixing now. And today is the day to start. So thanks for having this and hosting this, and really helping us all think more deeply about what we can do.
That's right. Today is as good a day as any. That's a good way to end on. Thank you both, and thanks to our attendees, and thanks also for the climate group for being a co-sponsor of this. So, thank you all.
Thank you.